Hello everyone, this is Hispa. Welcome to my channel. With this new video, I will expand my podcast series in which I will continue talking about the order in which the HeroQuest expansions are officially supposed to be played. In the previous part of this podcast, of course, a video you can also watch on my channel, I talk about the official play order for all the expansions released by Milton Bradley in the 90s for the classic versions of HeroQuest. But in this second part, I will do the same for the adventures released in recent years by Avalon Hill Hasbro for the modern version of the game. I can say that the number of official expansions released in this new era of HeroQuest is quite high, so I will try to keep the information as condensed as possible to avoid confusion. At the same time, I will use the video to also share with you all the details that have led to defining the official play order in recent years. But before we continue, as I explained it in my previous video about the classic expansions, I should clarify that Avalon Hill has never published an explicit official play order for the expansions. Furthermore, some members of the Avalon Hill design team have explicitly stated on several occasions that each HeroQuest expansion is generally intended as a standalone product, playable only with the components included in the expansion box and the base game box. Avalon Hill staff have even stated that most expansions should be playable even with heroes who have only completed the base game campaign. Therefore, the official play order I am going to describe in this video is simply the one Avalon Hill publicly accepts as correct from a narrative standpoint. However, much like Milton Bradley did in the 90s with the classic HeroQuest expansions, and as I will also explain at the end of this video, I suspect this official order is driven more by commercial considerations than anything else. Fortunately, however, enough information exists that has helped the fan community determine the official play order for the modern expansions if players wish to follow it in their games, and Avalon Hill has apparently accepted this order as correct. On the one hand, we have the story told through each campaign, which often introduces clear narrative links between its stories and characters, allowing us to follow how the overall story officially progresses through the different expansions. On the other hand, since the release of the new version of the game, Avalon Hill has also been providing specific tips via social media that also allow us to officially place most of the released expansions within a theoretical game timeline. So, based on all the information available so far, I will show in this video what is generally considered the official play order for the modern HeroQuest expansions and how this order was defined step by step. But to accomplish this task, of course, keep in mind that I will likely reveal spoilers in this video about the characters and story told in many HeroQuest products, so if you don't want to know, I recommend you stop listening. Okay, now let's continue with the video. Okay, but before we get to the main topic of this podcast, we need to consider some facts about the modern version of HeroQuest created by Avalon Hill Hasbro. This new version is mainly based on the classic American version of HeroQuest, but it also includes many elements from the classic European version and its expansions. At the time of recording this podcast, Avalon Hill had released 2 different base game campaigns, 11 expansion campaigns, and 6 free online promotional quests. However, 7 of those campaigns are re-releases of existing campaigns from the classic versions of HeroQuest, sometimes including significant changes to their original content, story, and background. Therefore, it's important to clarify that the official play order for those same expansions in classic HeroQuest doesn't necessarily apply to the modern timeline. For example, the official play order for classic HeroQuest began with the campaign included in the base game. However, this doesn't necessarily work the same in modern HeroQuest, as Avalon Hill has released different alternatives for starting the game in this new era, which I will explain. First, Avalon Hill released 2 free promotional quests to introduce new players to the game. These quests, Rogar's Hall and New Beginnings, were initially intended to be played individually as a prelude to the base game campaign. In April 2022, Avalon Hill confirmed to fans that the events of New Beginnings take place before Rogar's Hall, which makes sense as New Beginnings is where the heroes meet for the first time to play their first quest. This confirmation also allowed both quests to be part of the same official storyline, should players wish to play them both. Secondly, Avalon Hill Hasbro even released a complete alternative starting campaign to the one included in the game system box within a low-cost edition of the HeroQuest base game known as First Light. This alternative campaign tells a different story than the campaign in the original game system box, but the events of both apparently occur in parallel as both campaigns end at the same time as the main story. The king trapped with his army in Kavakarn and the Witch Lord returning to life and creating a new army in the ruins of Kalos. So I think each of these two starting campaigns indirectly assumes that the events of the other parallel campaign have also occurred, so regardless of which campaign players play first, whether it's the one in the original game system box or the one in First Light, their choice won't affect which expansion should officially be played next. I believe this was also an attempt to avoid introducing narrative constraints between different HeroQuest products so as not to affect their potential sales. So if we start building the complete official timeline, New Beginnings should be the first quest played. Then Rogar's Hall quest should be played, and then the campaign from the original game system box should be played, or alternatively the campaign included in the First Light box, but only one of the two should be chosen if we were playing with the same group of heroes. After that, I suppose for the same reasons I already explained in my podcast number 4, the new modern version of Kellar's Keep should be the next expansion that is officially played. However, Avalon Hill Hasbro also released a free promotional quest titled The Forsaken Tunnels of Sorcel, which should be played right before Kellar's Keep. And what comes after Kellar's Keep? Well, according to the classic versions of HeroQuest, many fans thought the modern version of Return of the Witch Lord should have been played, but for some reason in modern HeroQuest it hasn't turned out exactly that way. The general consensus within the fan community for years, which can now be found published almost everywhere on internet, is that Avalon Hill's official order states that after Kellar's Keep you should play the Prophecy of Taylor expansion, then Spirit Queen's Torment, and finally, after those expansions, you should play Return of the Witch Lord. Well, I can confirm that the true origin of this consensus was the information posted in April 2022 on the All-In Forum website by, I would say, mysterious forum member who said he had asked Avalon Hill directly about this, and this was the order they confirmed for playing the Mythic Tire expansions. In his own words, Avalon Hill also told him that Crypt of Perpetual Darkness should be the last expansion played following the official storyline. As you can imagine, placing two fully new expansions between Kellar's Keep and Return of the Witch Lord has always bothered me since this information started circulating in the fan communities. Just like in the classic HeroQuest base game campaign, both the initial campaigns of modern HeroQuest, the game system campaign and the First Light campaign, conclude by introducing the story of the Kellar's Keep expansion and also that of Return of the Witch Lord, but there is no mention of any other story arcs. So I don't see any narrative reason to play those two Mythic Tire expansions or any others for that matter before Return of the Witch Lord. Furthermore, I don't see any connection between the events of Prophecy of Taylor and the story told in Spirit Queen's Torment that establishes a natural order between them. So forgive me for being so skeptical, but given all this, I wonder how credible the information provided by this mysterious forum member really was. Therefore, due to the great relevance of this data to the legacy of HeroQuest, I asked this person at the time if he could provide the fan community with any proof of what he were publicly reporting. But unfortunately, he did not share any proof. Anyway, according to subsequent exchanges on social media between Avalon Hill and some other fans of the game, including myself, it is known that Avalon Hill now accepts this play order as correct. Therefore, this order has been widely considered since then as the official order for all the expansions. Later in July 2022, the same mysterious forum member reported again on the old Link forum website that Avalon Hill had confirmed to him that the recently released modern version of the Frozen Horror should be played after Return of the Witch Lord. Again, I asked this fan for documentary evidence of the Avalon Hill posts on Twitter from which he supposedly obtained the information he was sharing, and just like the first time I asked, I unfortunately received no successful response. Moreover, just a few weeks ago, when I was preparing this podcast, I even asked him privately once again about the origins of all that apparently official information he shared back then, but of course again without success. So I have no idea how this person obtained all this relevant data in advance. But of course, in the end, everything he said seemed to be surprisingly correct. Anyway, for the expansions released later, Avalon Hill thankfully started directly providing some clues to fans through their social media accounts when they were asked about the order in which the new expansions should be played, which forever prevented the appearance of unreliable sources of official information on this matter. With the re-release of the modern version of the Frozen Horror, Avalon Hill also released a free promotional quest titled Into the Northlands, which story was intended to be played just before the Frozen Horror campaign. Following the official timeline in August 2022, Avalon Hill officially confirmed via their Sargon Twitter account that the next expansion to be played after the Frozen Horror would be the modern remake of the Mage of the Mirror. They even confirmed in the same message for the first time publicly that the last expansion to be played at that time would be the Crypt of Perpetual Darkness. Later, the Rise of the Dread Moon expansion and its free promotional quest, Nightfall, were released. According to confirmation from Avalon Hill project lead Chris Nadeau to fans in October 2022, the events of Rise of the Dread Moon take place immediately after those of the Mage of the Mirror and before the story of Crypt of Perpetual Darkness. This was something fans had already suspected, as the events of Rise of the Dread Moon take place in the same Elven kingdom of Elethorn as those of the Mage of the Mirror. Regarding when to play the Nightfall promotional quest, Hasbro stated in their HasLab news in July 2023 that it was recommended to play this quest before playing Rise of the Dread Moon. Later, the redesigned classic expansion Against the Ogre Horde was released for modern HeroQuest, and Avalon Hill designer Doug Hopkins publicly responded in March 2024 to a message I sent him indicating that this new campaign should be played between Return of the Witch Lord and the Frozen Horror. Furthermore, this response implicitly confirmed too that the official timeline placement for the Frozen Horror and the other expansions that fans had been considering until then was also correct for Avalon Hill. 2 months later, in June 2024, coinciding with the release of the Jungles of Delrak expansion, an article on the digital portal Game Rant revealed that this new expansion takes place shortly before Crypt of Perpetual Darkness. Fortunately, the legendary fan Elveiler explicitly asked the portal about the source of this information, and they replied that Avalon Hill designer Doug Hopkins had confirmed it to them. And more recently, to complete the official timeline of modern HeroQuest expansions, Avalon Hill designer Doug Hopkins also responded to fans in October 2025 that the latest expansion to be released, Wizards of Morcar, should be played after Rise of the Dread Moon from a story perspective and before Crypt of Perpetual Darkness from a difficulty perspective, whatever that meant at the time, since apparently expansion difficulty had never been a criterion for Avalon Hill before. Furthermore, the free promotional quest Dread on the Horizon, released at Gen Con 2025, is a prelude to the Wizards of Morcar storyline, so following Avalon Hill's established practice with these types of promotional quests, it should, of course, be played officially before the promoted expansion. Well, this is the official play order that's published everywhere today and that Avalon Hill Hasbro accepts for all expansions released for Modern HeroQuest up to the date of this podcast publication. But as explained before, it seems that this play order only attempts to establish how the entire story should officially progress through the different expansions, and doesn't really attempt to cover other aspects such as the difficulty of the expansions or how the play order might affect the growth of the heroes. Of course, creating a complete and robust timeline that covered all aspects would have required Avalon Hill to implement a comprehensive development strategy for all HeroQuest products since the franchise revival began 6 years ago, which would likely have been impractical from a commercial and industrial standpoint. Therefore, demanding something like that from fans would certainly have been asking too much. But even trying to be understanding on that reality, I still think some aspects of the story could have been handled better. Firstly, I may be wrong, but my main concern with this official timeline is that some parts of it seem to have been defined solely for commercial convenience, rather than for the best narrative. A first example is the reappearance of Sir Ragnar in the Wizards of Morgar expansion. When the Rise of the Dread Moon expansion was released, many fans were disappointed about no Sir Ragnar miniature was included in its box. Therefore, Avalon Hill Hasbro apparently wanted to solve this by including the miniature in the Wizards of Morgar expansion box. Of course, I think Avalon Hill made a great business decision with this solution, as most of the fans love it. But unfortunately, I think it forced the designers to also introduce the character into the story of the new expansion, which in my opinion introduced too many unwanted plot twists into the background of this important character. The evil Sir Ragnar ended up in prison after the events of Rise of the Dread Moon, but strangely reappears as a free character at the beginning of the Wizards of Morgar expansion, with no explanation of how he gained his freedom. Furthermore, at a certain point in Wizards of Morgar, the character becomes good again and helps the heroes on their adventures as if nothing bad he had done before mattered. So, unfortunately, I think all these plot conveniences detract from the credibility of this important character's development within the overall story, but well, things are as they are. Another example of why I believe the official storyline largely responds to commercial interests is that there are expansions whose stories have no explicit narrative connection to any other expansion except perhaps the game system campaign. But Avalon Hill still chose to give them an official place in the main timeline. I am referring to those expansions with independent, self-contained stories explained from beginning to end, such as Prophecy of Telor, Spirit Queen's Torment, Against the Ogre Horde, The Frozen Horror, Jungles of Derrak, or even the beginning of The Mage of the Mirror and Crypt of Perpetual Darkness, which has no real plot connection to the expansions that, in theory, should be played before them. Avalon Hill's effort to guide fans on where to place these standalone expansions in the official timeline is commendable. However, in my opinion, they could all have been placed at any point in the overall story from a narrative perspective. Furthermore, I believe some of these decisions even introduced new narrative flaws. The first flaw that comes to my mind is, of course, when the events of Return of the Witch Lord officially occur in the timeline. I must confess that I find it hard to accept that our wise mentor would prefer to send the heroes to randomly investigate Melar's path in the Prophecy of Terror expansion, instead of sending them directly after Gellar's Keep to destroy an existing unknown threat, the Return of the Witch Lord in Kalos. Furthermore, I also have serious doubts about the official placement of Spirit Queen's Torment expansion in the timeline. The event that triggers this expansion is a sudden attack by Sargon's army, which could apparently fit easily into the story at any point, even where it was officially placed. But I am sorry, I also find it hard to believe that Sargon would launch a new attack after Kellar's Keep without Witch Lord's forces, since they are supposed to be ready soon by the end of the game system or First Light campaigns, and even less likely that they would launch such an attack after having provided military support to Fermarak in the events of Prophecy of Telor. Mentor's words at the end of the game system and First Light campaigns are very clear and serious about how dangerous Witchlord's return is. Therefore, I always saw it as very weak from a narrative point of view to introduce any other campaign before defeating the Witchlord. So, if we also remember how opaque it was the first time the play order was revealed to fans regarding this part of the timeline, which I already explained earlier in this video, I am sorry, but I can only guess that perhaps Avalon Hill supported this play order for purely commercial reasons. Why? Well, perhaps they needed to bolster from a marketing perspective the later release of the retail versions of the Mythic Tire campaigns and thought it was a good idea to place them in the timeline right within the more well-known classic campaigns, Kellar's Keep and Return of the Witch Lord. Or maybe the Prophecy of Telor and Spirit Queen's Torment expansions had to be placed in the timeline close to the base game campaign because the new artifact cards from those expansions were included in the game system box. Well, of course, this is all speculation on my part, but I suspect that a combination of these non-story related reasons might explain where they were ultimately placed officially in the timeline. Another problem I see is the official placement of the modern version of the Against the Ogre Horde expansion in the timeline. Just like its classic counterpart, the events of the modern Wizards of Morcar expansion begin by continuing the story of Festral, an evil sorcerer who appears in the events of Against the Ogre Horde. However, Wizards of Morcar makes no mention to any one of the crucial events that occur in the other three expansions that are officially supposed to be played before: the Frozen Horror, the Mage of the Mirror, and Rise of the Dread Moon. This, in my opinion, is hard to believe and makes the narrative feel incomplete. There are also several minor narrative inconsistencies in the official play order, but I think they are more easily forgiven. One of them is Skullmar's escape with Sir Ragnar's help. The story seems possible as told in the promotional quest Nightfall, and it even fits with the conclusion of the classic European version of the Return of the Witch Lord expansion, which I think is great. However, I also find it hard to believe that such events take place just before Rise of the Dread Moon and not much earlier in the timeline, since the events of Return of the Witch Lord, where Skullmar first appears, are supposed to have occurred up to 3 expansions before Rise of the Dread Moon. But again, this was probably decided for commercial reasons, as this promotional quest uses physical elements included only in the Rise of the Dread Moon expansion, such as the Spectres and Arcane Rag models. Another minor narrative conflict in the official timeline concerns the Witch of the Wild. In the description of the Hopkins Rest outpost that the heroes encounter in the Wizards of Morcar expansion, this character is presented as if the players already knew her place of residence beforehand. However, the only character with the same name appears in Quest 10 of the Jungles of Delrak campaign, an expansion that, according to the official timeline, should be played after the Wizards of Morgan 1. Well, I don't want to come across as soberly negative on this topic, as that's honestly not the intention of this podcast. I really appreciate the effort of the Avalon Hill Hasbro design team in trying to define a complete story for all the HeroQuest products, which is not an easy task. Furthermore, most of these minor flaws I think the official story has probably won't be noticed by most players during gameplay, so if they are, any Sargon player could probably fix them easily on the fly. But as I said, there are some other weak points in the main story that I think could be better ordered differently, and I am sure fans are defining other alternative play orders that also cover other aspects of the expansions, not just how the stories should connect. Anyway, this video is already getting too long, so I think it's a good idea to leave the order in which I would recommend playing all the modern HeroQuest expansions for a future podcast. Then that's all for now. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the video. Subscribe to my channel to stay up to date with the upcoming videos if you like the type of content I create, and see you soon in my next video.